Chapter 24 is water, electrolytes, and acid base. Chapter 24 is pretty much a summation of concepts that we have been covering in other systems during the semester. Cardiovascular system, the respiratory system, and the urinary system are all key systems that play a role in maintaining a balance in water, electrolytes, and acid base. So let's go ahead and begin here. My first topic is going to be water. What I'd like to do is break up the presentation into three components. The first one will be water, the second will be electrolytes, and the third will be acid base, with the acid base containing two parts. Let's go ahead and get started with the water. So really, what makes a cell happy? There are three things that we must maintain balance in order for the cells to be able to work and do their job. So it's pretty much a collective action of all the systems working together based on the dynamics of water flow. Okay. So we look at water, we know we're pretty much made up of water. About 65% of it we find within the intracellular fluid compartment. And then about 35% is the extracellular fluid compartment. And remember, the extracellular fluid compartment is made up of the interstitial space. That's that space that exists between the cell and the capillary. And then there's the intravascular space. The intravascular space contains the blood plasma. The lymphatics also play a role. So they're part of the vasculature that makes up that 8% of the extracellular fluid. All right. So we know that fluid and understanding fluid, when we talk about fluid, we're talking about water. So the movement of water is based on following a concentration gradient. Okay, so we talk about water specifically as moving down these concentration gradients or up a concentration gradient based on osmosis. Okay, so osmosis, once again, is the movement of water across a selectively permeable membrane, going from an area of high water particle concentration to an area of low water particle concentration. Or another way to say it would be that the high osmolarity inside a compartment is what draws water from the outside, which might have a low osmolarity. Once again, osmolarity is what is determining the concentration of solutes within that solution. So it's the osmolarity that helps create that concentration gradient from one compartment to the other. Okay, so here we are, osmosis from one fluid compartment to the other determined relatively by the concentration of the solute. So just what I said. So each different compartment will have a different concentration of solutes within it, and that's what's going to drive the movement of water. Now remember, at the first of the semester I talked about the cell and the surrounding fluid and electrolytes around the cell is what's going to conduct the movement of water and these electrolytes in and out of these compartments. So the electrolytes are going to play a very specific role in this. Okay. So this slide helps you kind of create a visual of what we're talking about with the movement of water from one compartment to the other. So right in the center, you'll see a grouping of cells. And within those cells is the intracellular fluid, okay? And then the fluid that surrounds those cells is what we call the tissue fluid or the interstitial fluid, okay? So the intracellular fluid is within the intracellular compartment, and the tissue fluid or interstitial fluid is what is outside that cell. So what's going to dictate the movement? The concentration gradients. So if you see that the concentration gradient, in other words, osmolarity, might be higher in the bloodstream. So then water is going to tend to move out of the interstitial space and into the bloodstream to help create the equilibrium. Well, if water moves out of the interstitial space, if the water moves out of that tissue fluid that we're talking about moves out of the interstitial space and it goes right into the bloodstream, then if you lose that water, they have to make up for that water. So where are you going to get that water from? You're right, you're going to get it from the cells. So water is going to move out of the cells. So what happens to the cells as they lose water? They shrink. So if you're having to move water out of the cells into the interstitial space so that it enters the bloodstream to make up for the deficiency, then you're going to have to replace that. And that's where drinking water, because of the thirst mechanisms, will help you accomplish that. Okay. Now, we look at the next slide, which talks about water gains. Maintaining fluid balance is really important. That's what keeps you healthy. That's what keeps you moving. Having an adequate amount of water. And there's a couple of ways you can get water. Okay. So the gains come from two sources, either preformed from what you drink or what you eat. Okay. So that bowl of oatmeal and a big glass of orange juice or milk, that's the preformed water that you're taking in. The other is the metabolic water, what your body actually creates. And there's that beautiful chemical reaction that talks about aerobic metabolism. So cellular respiration is how we make water, is how your cells produce the water that you need. So when we talk about water, and we know that you have to make sure that you consume that preformed amount of water to keep your cells healthy, then you're going to have water losses as well. And when we talk about water losses, we talk about two different types, sensible water loss and insensible water loss. So what is sensible water loss? Sensible, that which is observable, that which you can see. You see that in the urine, you see it in the feces, and you see it in sweat, in either a resting or active, physically active adult. That perspiration, that sweat that's being produced, you can actually see that. So that's sensible water loss. Insensible water loss is what you can't see. It's what's unnoticed. So if you're sitting there talking to somebody and you're watching them talk, you can't see their breath, but they're in their breath when they exhale. In addition to carbon dioxide, there's going to be an insensible amount of water that's also lost. Okay? So when you put your hand in front of your mouth and you breathe out, you feel that warm moisture. That's that insensible water loss, that's what I'm talking about. And then there's cutaneous transpiration. That's where it just evaporates from your skin. So you're sitting there looking at your arm. Water's evaporating. Not a lot, and you can't see it, but it's an insensible amount that you're losing. And of course, it varies dependent on the environment and the type of activity. So the next slide is just giving you an example of that which is sensible and those that are insensible water losses. Okay. How do we regulate what we take in? Put a glass of water in front of you and instinctively most people will drink it. But if you're active, you're studying, you're preparing for your exam, you're focused on something of interest to you, you're probably not going to be thinking about drinking water because you're so into that space. But there are areas in your brain, specifically the hypothalamus, contains these osmoreceptors that can sense when your water levels are decreasing. And if you remember, we talked about the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system that helps to regulate drops in blood pressure and helping to change the movement of water from one compartment to the other, and specifically to helping stimulate the brain to drink more water. So when we talk about the regulation of intake, we have to focus on what the hypothalamus is doing. So that hypothalamus is going to be releasing an antidiuretic hormone, ADH, antidiuretic hormone. And that's being released from the posterior side, or the posterior pituitary gland. Okay, the pituitary gland has two components. It has an anterior and posterior. We call that the adenohypophysis and the neurohypophysis specifically. And I'll go through more detail in that when we cover endocrine. but it's the hypothalamus and those osmoreceptors that are being able to stimulate the sensation of thirst. In other words, it's sending messages to the brain. Brain recognizes that and then sends the message back to these nuclei within the hypothalamus that will stimulate the release of these chemicals that will help you hold on to more water. ADH will then stimulate the kidneys to hold on to more water. But at the same time, it's going to stimulate the thirst centers in your body. Okay. So you're going to get stimulated to drink more water. And so how much are you going to drink? Well, you're going to drink just enough. So there's this thing called short-term inhibition of thirst. So just cooling and moistening your mouth usually is enough to quench that initial thirst. So I've had patients who are waiting to have an operation performed. And of course, you haven't had anything to eat or drink after midnight. And commonly they'll sit there while they're waiting to undergo surgery, and they're talking to the anesthesiologist. And one of the most common things they say is, I really feel thirsty. So we give them these ice cubes, or we give them these little foam-like structures that are cool and are moistened, and they put that in their mouth, and they immediately start to feel better. They can focus on something else besides the thirst. Okay, and then as someone begins to drink more water, as you drink more water, the colder it is, the more satisfied you're going to be. And then there's going to be a point when you're drinking water that you stop drinking because you're no longer thirsty. And that's because the receptors inside of your stomach, when they're being distended by the input of water, start sending signals to your brain. And so within 30, 45 minutes, you get this real nice sensation that you're pleasantly full and you don't feel dehydrated anymore. So it's a nice mechanism to prevent you from over drinking water. Okay. So we get to slide 2414. This slide is very nice in just helping to kind of put it all together with regards to what really stimulates. What is dehydration? What is dehydration itself? Dehydration is a negative water balance. In other words, you haven't had enough of the free water, not the electrolytes, but just loss of free water. So when you lose just free water, there's an increase in the blood osmolarity. For osmolarity, once again referring to the concentration of the solutes within the blood, or specifically within the blood plasma. Okay, if you get dehydrated to the point where your blood pressure starts to drop, then there's the activation of the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system that you see there on the right-hand side. And what does that do? It helps stimulate the hypothalamic osmoreceptors. If you remember, angiotensin 2 is also a very potent vasoconstrictor. So if you vasoconstrict the blood vessels, it helps return blood back to the heart to elevate your blood pressure. And then it stimulates the kidney to release aldosterone. Well, it actually stimulates the adrenal gland to release aldosterone, which has an effect on the kidneys, so that your kidneys hold on to more sodium. And if you hold on to more sodium, then chloride follows. And since you're holding on to more salt, water follows. So that helps to replenish you. Okay, it's a nice mechanism of nice way of looking at these mechanisms to help you replenish water losses. The other way to regulate water is through the kidneys. Okay, and as we studied in the urinary system, we understand that there is a gradient, a concentration gradient that extends from the renal capsule of the cortex all the way down to the medulla, going from 0 to 1200 milliosmoles of salt, okay, sodium chloride. And it's this concentration gradient that is conducting the movement of water in and out of the renal tubules. And if you remember, it's the thin component of the nephron loop, of the descending loop, that's made up of simple squamous epithelium that allows the movement of water out of the tubular system and into the medulla or the parenchyma at that particular level. I'll be talking about electrolytes next. So move on to the next slide presentation.